Mark Zuckerberg and Meta are building a data center that's going to have as much annual energy consumption as New Zealand. Why would I bother optimizing my system? If all of mobility was fully clean, that would still not be as much of an impact as you could have just focusing on commercial property.
Hi, Stefan, and welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on. It'd be great to hear about who you are and why you do what you do, please.
No, thanks for having me, James. Really nice to be here. I suppose a little bit about myself. So I started my life working in big tech. I worked at Microsoft for a little bit in the kind of media and marketing side. I had a bit of a millennial epiphany that wasn't a positive contribution to the world, trying to get people to buy more Doritos and BA flights and dog food or whatever it was. So I went and did a sustainability degree for my master's up in Edinburgh and kind of landed sideways in building energy performance engineering. So I worked at a company called Hawley, mechanical electrical consultancy, full of some very, very intelligent engineers that are involved in some amazing projects. And I basically learned building engineering on the job, mechanical, electrical systems, and realized at that very early stage as well that there was a lot of challenges around accessing building data to try and drive those energy efficiency improvements. Sort of stepped out of that world a little bit sideways briefly and went into sort of broader smart buildings. I worked in the intelligent buildings team at Hawley. I was very lucky to be part of a lot of landmark early projects back in kind of 2015, 2016, the Deloitte offices that are still touted as some of the big smart buildings examples in the world, flying over to help Quadrille, doing Google's smart building strategy. And then kind of shifted gears and went in and worked client side. I worked at HB Revis on their Symbiosis solution, and then at WiredScore, writing the Smart Score framework in my initial role before having sort of various product and innovation roles in the business there.
And you've ended up founding MeterZ.
Yeah, so perhaps most importantly is that, now co-founded MeterZ, I should say, which is all focused on removing barriers to collecting and analyzing building energy data. So we're hardware focused and providing an energy data infrastructure layer for commercial real estate to underpin sustainability reporting, energy efficiency, even things like tenant recharge, and really just trying to mobilize the decarbonization of the built environment through that kind of enablement layer.
You said you had an epiphany and you went and did, was it carbon management at university?
Yeah.
What were you doing before? What was it always a passion, or was it really just the epiphany that you wanted to move into something completely different?
Yeah, I think the marketing always interested me because of the psychology behind it. And we had one of my modules that I really enjoyed when I was younger doing my marketing degree was all about consumer behavior and sort of how people are brought into certain things, colors, branding, all those types of topics. I realized quite quickly that working in that world, there's not much of a clean canvas or a clean slate. You always have kind of limitations and barriers around your creativity, what you can and can't do. And it also wasn't fact-based enough for me. And I simultaneously had this urge or this desire to try and have a bit more of a positive impact, which I think is the vanilla millennial in me. Not that that's a bad thing necessarily, but good to have that mindset, and that just kind of then somehow dragged me into the world of buildings. And I mean, you see that statistic thrown around quite often about the 40% of global emissions, right? I think commercial is 13%, the last one that I saw. So there's a real opportunity to make a big impact, and it's an industry which has been slow to evolve. So there's kind of a double opportunity, if you like, on that basis.
Yeah, which I think brings us on really nicely into the evolving and the slow process, which often gets touted around with commercial real estate as well. And how have you found that in terms of, I think it'd probably be interesting to hear your viewpoint from your history and not just MeterZ in terms of how you've gone about innovation and change and some of the barriers which you maybe have faced as trying to implement those changes in the industry, which is historically and famously known for being a little bit slow to want to change.
It is funny, isn't it? There's that, I can't remember if it was BCG or McKinsey, but they do that industry digitization index. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah.
And they categorize, different kinds of industries in terms of the level of digitization. And the last one that I saw had real estate came out, or construction of real estate, to be fair, came out second to bottom above agriculture and hunting in the index, which kind of says it all, right? But no, it's been an interesting journey. I do feel that I was fortunate, now in my 13 or 14 years working in this space, I was fortunate to be kind of at the genesis of that kind of tech innovation that was happening,
Yep.
and some of those first projects. And when I first started and I was working on the energy performance side, it was just all really old school. It was siloed control systems inside these buildings, and people trying to interact with them in the way that they always had done, and kind of we were operating in sort of an old school way. And I mean, to say it's old school, it's not really that old school. It's still very current. But our big customers when we were or clients when I was working at Horley in the energy performance group were mainly big universities. So in particular Oxford University. So we did a lot of work with Oxford University back then, focused on trying to reduce the carbon intensity of their estate. And I think they were, being the forward-thinking institution that they are, they were kind of ahead of the curve perhaps on a lot of those topics. But their systems just weren't up to scratch. Through no fault of theirs or any of the companies that were working there. They just hadn't really evolved into that digital age. So I was, as a graduate at Horley, I was walking around, taking manual meter readings, staring at ceilings in plant rooms, which is great for your posture when you're kind of walking around following pipes all day, and just trying to understand what was going on. I mean, the lab buildings were the main ones that were the real energy consumers. They all had these kind of gradients for pressure that they had to maintain. They had quite a few pathogen labs at Oxford that were, from a health perspective, quite critical that they were operating properly. Yep. We had to work with, and I think funnily, talking about barriers to change, we had some really interesting interactions there with some of the scientists or the professors as well, who were very, very particular about how their building was going to run, because it ultimately impacted their research. Yeah. Right. There were control variables around temperature, humidity, and things like that. We had one, I'll never forget, one scientist who was working on mind controlling flies with beams of light. So he was all of his experiments were about trying to shoot these rays of light at different frequencies at these flies, so they would change direction in the air. And it was meant to be this kind of early research around mind control, Planet of the Apes kind of stuff, really, for animal. And this guy was it was one of the creepiest interactions I've ever had, because I remember walking up into his office and it was just completely sterile. Everything was, it looked like the pen on his desk had been measured out by a ruler in terms of how far it was to the next one. And he was super resistant, right? Didn't want us to do anything that could potentially jeopardize his fly population that he'd been, his fruit fly population he'd been breeding for years under certain temperature conditions. So it's a whole range of things, really. Even back then, it was the systems, it was the people. It's difficult to make change happen, I think, in this space.
And then moving into the WiredScore, when did you join WiredScore in its evolution? Was it quite early on? And then that obviously moved forward and headed into the smart buildings world as well, quite heavily as well.
Yeah, so I joined right when they kind of moved into the smart buildings side. So it was shortly after they raised their Series A, I believe it was, and they'd done really well on the connectivity side, and WiredScore had a really good product market fit for its core WiredScore solution when it came out of New York. I won't spend too much time on the history. It came out of New York to try and drive an understanding of which building could offer that connectivity to modern companies, and then shifted over and is now a global brand that's well recognized. And I was kind of brought in right after they'd launched and written the first version of the Smart Score scorecard. Okay. And I was one of the, I would say, the specialists that came on board. The people who were working on the scorecard before had done lots of great research, but they weren't necessarily from that background. So, I kind of came in and I gave it a pretty strong revamp right at the start. But I really enjoyed that time working with Sanj in particular, who's head of research and a director of research at WiredScore, because it just gave me such a broad exposure to the different kinds of ways that people were thinking about it. There was so many meetings with different real estate organizations, asked them about their strategies, what they're implementing, why, and then trying to kind of collate that into a MECE framework, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive framework that could then be used ultimately to arbiter success in deploying these technologies. And it just seemed like such a great way to try and have an impact by giving people a North Star. I think building certifications are a bit Marmite. Some people love them, some people hate them. But they do have an impact to drive change. I mean, I think, BREEAM's a great example of that. BREEAM's not perfect, but I think there's a heck of a lot more sustainable buildings out there now because of BREEAM than there would have been otherwise.
Yeah, completely agree. Although, yeah, I think I'm in that half camp. It's like, it's great to have them, but what we want is actual change and actual impact. So kind of needing, my view is always kind of like both. No, that's really interesting. And then from that you set up MeterZ. Do you want to just explain kind of the problem that you're trying to solve with MeterZ, and why?
I think I have to really explain. I have to kind of start quite high level, which is that I'm a firm believer in this idea that technology or PropTech, which is not a phrase that I love, but that PropTech is for the few, not the many. At the moment, there's a real challenge in the industry around there being a huge saturation of solutions, really, that aim at the very top end of the market, because really only the top end of the market can afford them. There are not many buildings out there that can pay 20, 30, 40,000 pounds a year for a software subscription and fit that into their service charge, or depending on how that building or asset is structured, fit that into the budget elsewhere. And unfortunately, that top 1%, which actually a lot of the decarbonization solutions are aimed at, represents the smallest opportunity for driving change in the industry to actually decarbonize it.
Yeah.
The real problem is in the long tail. In the long tail of buildings, kind of the regional, call them grade B, grade C. I've not found a sexy marketing term for kind of not so nice assets that are out there, but that's really where the potential is, and that's where we need to be targeting. And unfortunately, I just felt like there was no real solutions out there that were going to support those buildings. And ultimately, what those buildings needed wasn't that complicated, anyways. They needed a decent set of information, and then a pair of eyes on that information to make decisions. And I saw very quickly that the pair of eyes exists. The most asset managers, property management companies, they all have great experts. And if they don't, they have consultants or other people they can speak to or engage with that have that knowledge, to drive off the back of the data. But the data was still the bottleneck, still the problem. And it's really pronounced not only in the UK, but all around the world, that people are really struggling to access the information that they need from their buildings to make decarbonization decisions, which is ultimately a public market failure, in my opinion. It's a failure of the smart meter rollout, which has been promised for a long time, but for various reasons has failed.
If you look at it in that worldwide view, there's probably one market which is, I think, doing it right, or trying to at least do it right, which has been France.
Yeah.
They seem to be the standout in terms of democratizing energy data, and that's really what MeterZ is all about, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I think in a world where it's not a public accessible data, which the UK certainly isn't.
And you know what, the UK is actually not that bad. I think the last statistics I saw from Ofgem were that something like 56% of commercial properties now have smart meters. The MOPS or the DCC is required to release that data. It's available on Electrolink, or like a Purse or an Arbanco, whatever kind of solution that you're using to scrape that utility bill data. The data that's on there is still imperfect. There's some challenges around, matching your actual meter number, your MPAN, to the address that you're dealing with, and doing that properly, especially when you don't have the serial number. Doing an address lookup can be confusing because the database is a little bit jumbled. There's quite a lot of estimated annual consumption in there, but it is giving people that first snapshot, that first set of available data. I think for us, it's about now taking that next step. As much as we do that total building consumption, is how are we going to go out and get truly accurate, granular information on all these buildings so people can do things. We work with a lot of companies that do renewable sizing. Very hard to do that, if you don't have a proper load profile on a building. We work with companies that are trying to understand their scope 1 and scope 3 emissions. So going behind the meter and understanding, well, what's actually the building, the landlord's consumption, or what's the tenant's consumption. So there's a lot of more work to be done even beyond the utility smart meter rollout. But even that first step hasn't been accomplished, and we're just trying to create a solution to that problem that can work quickly and now, because I think speed is of the essence as well with all the regulations and frankly climate changes. I think it's hard not to look at some of the weather patterns these days and think, oh, this not good. It just needs to go, and it needs to move, and I think that's why we're determined, Tassos and I in particular, to try and make that happen.
Yeah, I think relying on government, etc., to legislate and move isn't going to be the way. We've got to have industry leaders like yourselves and like the owners who are moving the dial to actually implement their their own changes and actually push forward the agenda themselves. And hopefully then government can catch up in due course, I guess.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And I think when you're talking about that data and going behind the curtain a little bit in terms of that first step, I think that brings us on quite nicely to a problem which is in the industry, which is the landlord-tenant relationship and how you're going about that process. Because historically, landlord-tenant has been quite adversary, I'd say, and the sharing of data seems a very weird concept in that relationship. And how are you getting around that? Are you finding that a big problem, especially on buildings where the landlord might have an interest but at the ownership of the building, but the tenant has full control of it, has the actual metering underneath their control? It's
tricky. I think this is the short answer. That and it really varies. I mean, I don't even know where to start. I mean, I suppose for everyone who isn't close to this process or doesn't necessarily understand how it works, typically, if you were trying to access a tenant's data in a building and that tenant manages the procurement of their own energy and is therefore the owner of that data, then you need to go through what's called a letter of authority process to access that information, which should be quite straightforward. It's a document that the tenant signs and gives you as a third party, whether or not that's a consultant or it's a software company or a property manager, whoever it is, permission to access their energy data, their information. Now, if they're not managing that, if they're not procuring that energy data, and this is already where it starts to get grey, because there's not a lot of legislation or clear rules about this stuff, but the industry standard seems to be, if they're not managing that data, i.e. if they're in a tenant recharge environment, so if you have a business park with one main incoming meter, and then you have, call it 10 industrial sheds, and you have, as the landlord, ownership of those meters and are trying to recharge your tenants on those meters, you as the landlord have legitimate interest in the data because you're trying to recharge and therefore do not need to request that authority off the back of it. Now, if you're not in that situation, if they have their own meters, which, for example, when we go to Switzerland or to Germany and do projects there, they always have their own meter and they always procure it and manage it individually, then you have to go through that process. And it creates a lot of bottlenecks and challenges. And I mean, it's a huge topic. We're part of various lobbying groups that are having these conversations, energy transformation, speaking to the government, trying to drive forward an understanding of how this works, but ultimately people are still getting into a lot of hot water with it because it is confusing and there's no clear guideline, and simultaneously, as we mentioned before, you have that kind of that pressure from above, from the regulators, and I think that desire to do more, which is pushing against that bottleneck and creating friction ultimately. I mean, there's some tenants as well. They just don't want to share data at all. Yeah. I think some of the tech companies in particular are quite resistant. We recently started working with Gowling, who have been brilliant. They're providing us pro bono legal support as part of a kind of a venture program for kind of sustainability related startups. Awesome team, really intelligent people, and they're really interesting speaking with their real estate legal team because they're saying, well, actually, we completely get your side of the story, which is you're trying to drive forward this agenda. But we also understand that they represent a lot of tenants and large multinational tech companies in particular who are saying, well, we don't want to share the data because we see the value in it, right? And it's this weird standoff at the moment, and it's not helped by the potential, I think, litigation side, right? Because I mean, we do lots of projects as well where recharge is a topic and meters aren't working correctly, and then you end up in a hot fuss. The amount of projects that we've gone into, or we've integrated with an existing metering system or placed check meters and then found out that the existing meter that was there hasn't been working properly for mystery number of years, that's a can of worms for that landlord to open up. So it's really difficult when you have these, I suppose, challenges or obvious issues on the way that you're going to face when you really start opening the door to all the information you're building. Because as you're saying, that tenant-landlord relationship is ultimately a structured contractual relationship, and if people feel like they're being short sold or something's wrong, then they're quite likely to take that forward in kind of a legal way.
Really, it's unfortunate. It's a huge miss in the industry, and it's something which has to change. I think there has to be some way of changing that relationship to allow that data share. And I think for you, why do you see energy data being so important? Obviously, I think I've got an idea from your carbon management background, but I think it'd be really interesting to hear your thought on that.
It's interesting just on the data point before we move on. There's a lot of talk about trying to turn it into this open banking model, right? So you get the way you can run a credit check on someone, you can run an energy data check, and I think there's a lot of legitimacy behind the concept because ultimately energy data underpins a lot of financial products. These days people have green leases, people have green finance that they're trying to access. Their kind of rating from an investor perspective is based on their energy performance or on their carbon performance. So it really does make sense that we push towards that kind of angle. But the privacy side is what's pushing against it. We're talking about commercial, and I think the argument from my point of view, the argument that energy data for a commercial entity is commercially sensitive is a difficult one to defend. I don't necessarily think how you're going to lose any competitive advantage or anything is going to be different. Maybe some of the AI companies that are building the latest models disagree. They don't want anyone to know how much their data center is consuming, so they don't know how efficient it is. I don't know what's out there, but we haven't even spoken about the residential side, and I think that's actually where a lot of the issues, the regulatory issues, are coming from. Is that those two things are being treated as one and the same. I think it's a valid thing to say that someone's energy consumption at home, where they pay for that energy data, is their personal data. It's part of their personal information set, and it makes it's personally identifiable because it's linked to an address ultimately, and that they should have control over that. But because the serial number, the MPAN, the structure for energy metering and data collection is no different in a residential environment to how it is in a commercial environment, it all kind of gets thrown into the same pot, and that's where a lot of those challenges come from.
Yeah, and do you think when I've spoken to, in particular, probably actually large retailers as well, I get the feeling that there's nervousness about sharing that data because their own reporting, to their investors, etc., is reporting that energy data is really important for them as part of that, and they want to have control of that, and they want to make sure that they're the ones reporting it, and people can't find out that information in terms of that, and maybe looking after that data a little bit.
Yeah.
That overall, if you've got a portfolio of X number of buildings and you can only get 50% or X percentage, how are you able to then really verify that to your own investors?
Yeah. No, and it's so there's just this, it's fear. I ultimately think it's fear. Especially for the people who are maybe not as close to tech, they've had it drilled into them that data is now this really critical commodity, and that they need to protect their data and all data that the company owns at all costs. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? But there's certain data sets that maybe aren't so critical, and you will need to probably share anyways in the future. I mean, I remember when I was at Future PropTech, which was the forerunner to CRE tech, back in the early, I think it was in Olympia in London, or by Angel, it doesn't matter. And there was a big panel. This must have been 2016, 2017. There's a big panel, a bunch of real estate, asset managers, CEOs were being asked about the benefits, the value of sharing data more openly in the real estate ecosystem to support transactions, just create general transparency for everyone who's trying to invest in that financial product as the true performance of that building. And they all spoke, waxed lyrical about how great it would be if everyone did that. And then at the end, the moderator asked, "So are you going to do it?" And they all said, "No, no way." Right? They just wouldn't even consider it. They wouldn't entertain it. So it's a combination of fear and just mindset. I think that's part of the challenge for change and trying to get people to be open about it. But I've digressed. You asked me about the value of energy data.
Yeah, and why is it so important in our industry?
Yeah,
particularly our industry in context, but obviously we know it's important wider than our industry. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I think I've touched on a couple points. A couple points already. Ultimately, there's a regulatory pressure now, and I think that's what's really moving the needle is the stick, not the carrot. There's there's a lot of talk now about new sustainability regulations and reporting requirements coming into the UK, which I think are hopefully, and that's slightly self-serving as one of the co-founders of MeterZ, but also from a wider impact perspective, I think really critical. Hopefully, going to come into place. So,
and which ones are those? For people who are not aware?
I mean, most people are reporting into the kind of standard optional ones at the moment, right? So you've got things like GRESB and BREEAM that already spoke about, which are important and they're already kind of a benchmark. But there's this conversation, I don't know whether there's actually a name for all of them yet, to be honest. But there's conversations about bringing in kind of mandatory carbon disclosure for the real estate sector and the UK in general for large organizations, which is going to match kind of the EU CSRD style reporting. Obviously, that's being scaled back, and they've had some teething problems with how it worked. It was far too onerous, and I mean, having spoken to some of the consultants and people working on it, really was a lot, and a lot of it was kind of fluffy and didn't need to happen. But I think that's ultimately the way that the UK is going to head as well. Is that we'll have that push, and a lot of our customers are actually funds that have a combination of European and UK assets, and are therefore kind of front running that in the UK, and have to be part of that early shift. So no, I think that's going to be really important, is just the reporting side. And then there's just the decarbonization. I mean, Workman and IBOS work loads on BMS controls and energy efficiency, right? It's just kind of where the rubber meets the road.
Yep.
As far as energy data goes. What are you doing with your systems? Why is your chiller running at full pelt in the middle of winter? Which is all the kind of crap that you hear about all the time in the industry. But people just aren't aware, and they don't do anything about it because they don't have that thread of energy data pushed through.
The visibility.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, going back to what you're saying, I think for me, something I'm quite passionate about is probably two parts in terms of how we look at the buildings. It's energy intensity and carbon intensity. And when the regulatory catches up, and I think it will do, actual in-use energy intensity and carbon intensity scoring on buildings is going to be the big ticket. And I think that will drive huge change and hopefully some really big innovation, and make it even more important to be capturing that data correctly.
Yeah, no, 100%. And we should speak about assurance and data quality in a moment as well, because it's a really important thing. But just on your point there, NeighBORS, for anyone who doesn't know what NeighBORS is or hasn't heard about it, is an Australian scheme which does exactly what you just described, isn't it? It's all focused about energy performance in use. It's quite rigorous, and when it was mandated in Australia, it completely changed the game.
Yeah.
They have some of the most energy efficient and sustainable building stock in the world now, purely because they've moved away from kind of an EPC style assessment, which is still what we have here.
Theoretical.
Yeah, exactly. Finger in the air. Oh, your windows that you installed 20 years ago were working like this. Maybe we never actually tested it, but that's what our modeling said.
Yeah.
To actually just looking at, well, this is your energy consumption. This is how big your building is. There's your score, and it should be that simple, because it is that simple. Really.
It is. But one day it'll catch up.
Yeah. I mean, on the assurance point, I think it's a really interesting topic that we've been dealing with a lot. Is that, and this is one of the challenges with the kind of the Electrolink and MPAN database point as well, is that a lot of the information that's in there is manually read, and a huge amount of our projects are about reducing manual meter reading. We come into projects where people do 5, 6, 8 days a month of manual meter readings, especially large shopping centers, places where there's a large density of tenants to kind of square meter. And you can imagine that person that's doing those meter readings is going completely insane.
Yeah.
Imagine, and I can barely get my 3 readings at home, right? My gas, water, electric. Imagine doing 3 readings for 200, 300 retail units over the course of a week. 3s become 8s. You start jumbling numbers around. You forget the key to one of the meter lockers. Scribble something down, right? Who can be bothered? 'Cause it's such low value work for someone as well. In an age where we're all talking about automation and AI, you've still got someone walking around scribbling down numbers, which is just ridiculous. Doing manual data entry.
And really is seen as the norm.
Yeah.
Which, in this day and age, it does seem baffling.
It's so backwards. I mean, some of the projects that we've spoken about, where just all over the UK, and we see it all the time. I was speaking to some of the team at Collier's last week. We were talking about similar challenges at a few of the industrial parks that they're working on, and the term the AMR, automatic meter reading, has been around for a long time, but it's a dated term at the same time, because it's not really automatic beyond it being on a screen somewhere in a basement.
And confusing.
Yeah.
I think the whole terminology, the whole AMR terminology, especially in the industry, because AMR means different things in the same industry, which also is really confusing. I think it's generally quite a confused world in that sense, isn't it?
Smart metering is a great example as well. We speak to loads of, I mean, the word smart is its own, like the thing, isn't it? But we speak to loads of customers that are talking to us about how they're undergoing their smart meter rollout, which when they say that, what they mean is that their utility provider is working with their meter operator, their MOP. So Octopus is working with EDF MOP, or Stark or RimServe to deploy smart meters on the main incomers for their buildings. And they then believe that once those are installed, they will have full and easy and simple data access at all time. It's not the case.
No.
It's not the case. And I think there's just this confusion around the terminology, as you say, right? Automatic, smart. There are all these kind of sexy words that people are trying to throw in to make things sound like they're going to be just simple and seamless from that point forward. But it's quite the opposite. And it's such a, metering, quite frankly, such a boring topic. People don't really want to engage with it, right? I mean, it's almost as an industry. It's almost as well, it's not as old as real estate. That's hyperbole. But, since we've been paying for utilities, electricity, water, gas, I have no idea how long ago that was, maybe the early 1900s. I'm sure there's been metering, right? And people have been doing it the same way almost since. So it's ripe for change. It really is, and it needs to change to support this decarbonization that we're talking about.
And I think that's it, isn't it? Fundamentally, energy data, without knowing what your energy data is for a property, how are you going to implement change to drive it to net zero?
Yeah.
I think that's as simple as it is. You need the data to understand where your baseline is, where you are, and then what you need to do to move the dial.
Yeah. And it's so important as well. I think I've heard a few people say recently that they've given up on efficiency, which I think is such a stupid thing to say. There's this mindset, Mark Zuckerberg and Meta are building, a data center outside Washington, D.C. that's going to have as much annual energy consumption as New Zealand. Why would I bother optimizing my systems? Why would I bother doing something? Well, I mean, first of all, there's cost, which I think is an obvious argument, right? You're going to save money by doing this. But second of all, it's like deciding at home that, oh, well, actually, I've got solar panels on the roof now, so I'm just going to leave everything on.
Yeah.
All the time, because I don't really care. I just don't know how people can go to bed at night thinking that way, and thinking that that's okay.
Yeah, I think, we saw a real shift change in terms of focus on things like IBOS, for example. Obviously, it was important. Smart building, intelligent buildings was growing and really important. But then, kind of our service and kind of what we're trying to do, which is essentially make buildings more efficient and more energy efficient, and optimized, then got really serious when suddenly energy prices changed.
Yeah.
And it needed something like that to really spur people on. And maybe people are starting to get a bit just blind to that now because they're so used to these elevated prices which we're in now and needs a refresh maybe.
Yeah. And I think there's this mindset that renewables are just the answer. And then that's what I keep hearing. It's like, well, I've got two choices. I can either try and optimize and reduce, or I can just get, a PPA, stick a bunch of solar on the roof and go, why can't you do both?
Yeah.
And does it not make sense for you to do both? Because I think the really critical thing is just the amount of easy wins, right? Yeah. People, you don't need to PID, I'm going to say a bunch of technical words now, but you don't need to, fine tune PID loops on controllers in your building. And
what's a PID?
It's basically when you do the controls on a building, right? You do the BMS, you have the actual curve, which is controlling the valve positions and things, and you can make minor gains by basically adapting those things. But the critical thing is just turning things off that shouldn't be running.
Yeah, first step should be get the energy data, optimize how the building's running, get it running as best as you can, and then your renewables come after. You're going to be spending a lot less money on your renewables because you've got a lower baseload to be handling in the first place. So you should be following those sort of steps in that sort of order so that you can actually then make the most impact for as little cost as possible as well. Yeah,
no, exactly. And I remember we worked on a project that shall remain unnamed for the purpose of this public conversation. But we worked on a project back when I was at Horley in central London. It was South London actually. Massive new development, mixed use kind of resi retail. Had gym in it, all that kind of stuff. And they'd specified, I think it was 3 CHPs, three combined heat and power turbines as part of BREEAM, which was all the craze back then with BREEAM, is to get these combined heat and power turbines. And they came to us and they said, well, we've got these immensely high energy bills. They were going through millions and millions of pounds a year. And, they said, well, we just can't figure it out. We don't understand where we're burning all this energy. And we were on site for about a day. And I'm looking at all the systems, the BMS panel, the logs and stuff. I was just looking at it and I was just like, well, you turned the CHPs off because they didn't know how to use them, right? So they're just running the boilers.
Pretty standard.
Pretty standard move. But they'd forgotten to turn the pumps off that were running water through the CHPs, and they were just running at full pelt. So they had like 3 sets of parallel pumps that were rated like 330 kilowatt each that were just running at full pelt, pumping water through these CHPs. And you're just like, so what, you're burning like a megawatt of energy? Constantly trying to do this. It's just ridiculous, that kind of stuff. And I do think there's an endemic challenge there around the facilities management and the building engineering space as well. That the facilities management industry has been a race to the bottom on cost for so many years, and the people, unfortunately, that are being asked to operate the buildings are not particularly well paid and therefore not particularly high skilled. They're great at doing basic maintenance. They can, fix locks, fix doors, do the kind of more manual side of the work. But when it comes to more in-depth engineering skill sets, they typically need a hand, basically. Yeah. And their focus is less on energy normally and more on comfort and just keeping the thing running, right? So yeah, it's hard.
So I think that brings us on nicely to kind of big picture position, really. So why is change required in the industry, and why is it so important?
I alluded earlier to the 40% of global emissions conversation, right? And I think change in the industry it goes beyond climate as well. I think you can talk about how we use our buildings and do that more effectively. We have changing kind of town centers, communities. There's a whole world of topics that you could cover in theory, but focusing on the climate side, the change that we need to make as an industry is going to be one of the big kind of pieces that moves the dial towards a more sustainable future. I don't think there's any question about that. So much focus on the transition to kind of decarbonize mobility, EVs and hydrogen powered lorries and trains and all those things. That if all of mobility was fully clean and green, that would still not be as much of an impact as you could have just focusing on commercial property.
Yeah.
Right. And if you look at the attention that goes into mobility and the interest versus what goes into property, it's night and day.
It's staggering, isn't it?
There's just I don't know whether it's been marketed poorly or it's just not as sexy. People don't see it as much, which is not true because we see buildings all around us all the time, right? But we just kind of take them for granted. But it's so critical that something happens now, and I think there's a lot of different component parts to that change being put in place. I mean, you've been more involved with real estate than I have for even longer, so I think you've probably seen it. Call it on the dark side for even longer than I have. But it's hard, isn't it? It's hard to drive it forward.
Yeah, it's bringing light to some of the dark arts which people see in buildings and really showing them that it is possible to change, and you don't have to run a building and work in the same way which we have done for however long. We can change. Yeah. And yeah, we've made some really big impact, and there's so much more to go at. So it's really it's exciting. It's exciting to be part of that change, isn't it? And you're obviously quite passionate about that as well. As feel like we're doing something that's legacy. It's going to be making an impact, and we'll hopefully see that in the future.
Yeah, and I think the critical thing, especially for the real estate industry, is that the technology is there. Yeah, we don't need the next shiny thing. There's been so much buzzword bingo over the last 5-8 years, which I think has actually been really toxic for our space. The kind of the important objectives which can actually be achieved with technology like decarbonization have been kind of lost in this quagmire of buzzwords around all the tenant engagement or whatever, God knows what, some kind of crazy thing that's going on. And don't get me wrong, they all have their merits. They're all good things, but we need to really pull back now and focus on the critical issues facing the industry, and the critical issues, or the critical issue from my perspective, really is the piece around decarbonizing it, and that's also, I mean, there's obviously a lot of other issues as well, so don't get me wrong, but the piece that technology can influence most out of those critical issues that real estate has is the decarbonization, and the tech really is there. It's just about breaking down all the structures and the complexities. MeterZ is really interesting because in that sense, because we sell into such a broad spectrum of organizations. What we do is applicable to a whole different range of types of businesses. We sell into companies that are owner operators, and so they're large multinational, household brands, companies like Ryman, that own a lot of real estate, retail. They own their own distribution centers. They pay their energy bills, and they have a vested interest in not only decarbonizing but just saving money. At the end of the day, that's what they want to do. Then we sell into a kind of owner operator in the real estate sense, where they have an embedded property management, facilities management function as part of the asset function. So one of our big customers is a company called Via Outlets. Absolutely brilliant. I'm traveling over to Sweden tomorrow to go see their Swedish center. We're doing 3 centers with them already, big fashion outlet centers. And they have a vested interest in saving money because they also pay a lot of bills, but more critically because they're fully in charge of the decarbonization of their portfolio, because all that function sits in-house. So they really need the data not only for their sustainability team, but they need it for their facilities team. They need it for their, their asset team, and it kind of starts to come. And then you go and starting to come into the broken apart side, right? You have the asset manager who's interested, but ultimately outsources the problem to consultants and property managers. Consultants and property managers are trying to get the data, but they have different asset types that they're dealing with, where it's really complicated. It's a real quagmire of confusion, I think, as to who the ultimate beneficiary, and therefore ultimately the person who should be paying for an energy data solution, should be. And that's the hard part to break down. It's not the tech. The tech is there for us to drive that change, and I think there's organizations that are deploying that in a meaningful way to try and make that change happen, that are out there. But it's just trying to break down that really confusing layer cake, which I think, this is my opinion, I'd be curious to hear yours, but I think it just comes out of age. It's one of those things, it's an industry that's just been around for so long that it's grown organically, and just when that happens, I think you just get a huge amount of stakeholders and call them middlemen in some instances, who don't you aren't really sure what role they're still fulfilling, but they're there because they've always been there.
Yep.
And they have relationships, and therefore they're just not going to be removed either from the additions.
Well, that actually really brings us nicely into my last question, and one which I like to ask all my guests, which is, does commercial real estate need evolution or revolution?
I suppose it comes down to how you define the two. How would you define evolution versus revolution? Is that for me to define?
That's for you to define.
For me to define. I'm going to go with evolution. When I think of revolution, I think of completely upending all the existing structures which exist, which I don't think is necessary. I think there are a lot of great real estate companies out there that are trying to do good work and that are driving the change. I think the key for me is what I mentioned at the start, is making that change accessible for that longer tail of buildings out there. We can't all be applauding, the superstars, the Hines and the Schroders and the Grosvenors. They're brilliant organizations, and I love, the Crown Estate. I love what they're doing from a climate perspective, and that they're pushing on, but they still only represent such a small portion of that stack, of that pile of buildings that we need to deal with. And it's about how we take those learnings and the great things that those amazing front-running organizations do and apply them to that long tail. And for me, that's not a revolutionary concept. It's just about kind of, greasing the wheel. I think it's a good way to think. MeterZ is an interesting analogy, because we're not a deep tech company. We're not trying to invent a miracle cure for cancer, or inventing the next light speed rocket booster. We're delivering a service around energy data, which is hardware focused. It's based ultimately on metering integration and placement. It's just slightly better, slightly faster, and ultimately more cost effective critically than what's out there at the moment, and that's what makes it accessible to the long tail. And I think that's what it is. It's just an evolution that needs to happen, not a.
And I think that's kind of how we got in initial contact. Really, is putting in solutions which are scalable and affordable across whole portfolios, and that's how we're going to really drive change, isn't it?
100%. We need to be dealing with those, 10 room small regional offices in places around the country, and small industrial parks, not just the latest new build in central London that's got a multi-million-pound Schneider control package that, quite frankly, works pretty well. That's good stuff. Anyways, it's about those other buildings that don't have access to that kind of wealth, both in literal and figurative sense, and from a knowledge perspective, to be able to do stuff.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. It's been great having you on and hearing your insights and genuinely your passion around driving change and innovation in this industry. So thank you.
No, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.